Sometimes the subject matter expert was, in fact, a true subject matter expert. They were integrating years of experience. They were integrating lots of models, but sometimes they had never been on a search before. But they were in charge and they were telling you where to go. The second approach is given the fancy term of a stochastic approach, which is just a way of saying, can we use statistics? Does the past, in fact, predict the future? So the basic answer to that, well, we hope so, if you're using this book, because you're using past cases to look for somebody who's probably not in the database. I got a couple of repeat customers in the database, but most people are it's their first time search. Sort of the limitations of that is, in fact, every human being is, especially when you're talking about stressed out, lost human beings, they are not in the database. So I say, when people ask me, can you tell me where the lost person is? And the quick answer is no, I can't. Everybody is too unique and too different for me to predict. And if you want to get into chaos theory of just one small little difference right at the IPV can make a huge difference where they wind up, you can go that way and talk about Jurassic Park and butterflies and all that good stuff. But more importantly, and what kind of works for us, is while I can't tell you where a single person is, I can tell you if 100 people got lost from that IPP, what would be the distribution pattern? Lots of people would be found here. A few more people might be found over here. Just about nobody would go over there. And then, we should look there, and we should look there, and we shouldn't look there until a whole lot later. You do search long enough, you're going to see that weird case. But if you're doing search long enough, you are now essentially playing the casino. Do you want to have the house rules where the odds are in your favor, or do you want to be the gambler? If you're a one-time gambler, you might come out ahead. If you're a chronic gambler, you're going to lose. The next approach is fancier. It's called agent-based modeling or particle motion approach. This is where you use a computer, and the computer tells you where it thinks the lost person is going to be based upon a bunch of rules that somebody threw into a black box and nobody usually ever understands. But a lot of people are just perfectly happy to go wherever the computer said. So this is the approach the U.S. Coast Guard uses with its SAR ops thing. It starts at the initial planning point, and then it starts drifting particles of different types. There is the U.S. government working on something called LandSAR that uses the same approach. It's usually just time, distance, cost, distance, travel, different types of terrain. You can travel at different speeds, and terrain elevation. It's not looking at a heck of a lot of things. A lot of academic researchers who like to develop fancy sounding stuff with heuristics and particle motion, and they're working on it, but nothing is really ready for prime time operational use. I'm rather fond of what I call the ensemble approach. I think each of these approaches have their own unique advantages and disadvantages. And I'd like to see what each model does. It's kind of like if you're looking at a weather forecast, you can see what the European model says, you can see what the American model says. When they all agree, you can pretty much with high confidence say that's a good place to go. When they all disagree, you scratch your head. And a lot of times you learn the strengths and weaknesses of each of those models. Oops. Okay. Another concept I introduced in the new book, which was always an important part of my class, is what I call probabilistic thinking. I mean, if you even get to the term POA, probability of area or probability of containment, it's basically we don't know where the missing subject is. But let's look at a case study. We got an 81-year-old with moderate dementia
high blood pressure, heart disease, arthritis, and overweight. She has wandered 3 times before, and on each of those 3 cases, she was found in the facility. It's currently a degree above freezing, my clever way of getting around the Fahrenheit Celsius issue. And the sun has just set. She's wearing a dress with a light sweater and does not know the area at all. She's only been here for 3 weeks. Where do you think she's most likely to be found? The facility. I mean, I would say the facility too. Now, here's the thing. You can do what I call scenario lock and like, well, she's going to be in the facility, and that's as far as your planning goes. And if that's as far as your planning goes, what are you going to do if she's not in the facility? If we look at some of the most likely location, if we look at the probabilities, we can already see I've put up the 25% range and I've put up the 50% range. So 25% chance she's in there and another 25% chance she's from that ring to that ring. 9% are found within 100 meters of the IPP. That's a new model that'll be in the new book called the point model. So it just tells you like, hey, if you got very few resources, make sure you bang out 100 meters right around. You got a 9% chance of finding her. 50% are found within 15 meters of a linear feature. There's our 25%. There's our roads, and there's our drainages. 25% of the time they're found in a facility. 10% of the time they're found near a creek. And 96% of the time, folks with dementia are in fact lost and out there in the woods versus any of the other potential scenarios. Where did she wind up? Right down there. So, wasn't the facility this time. So, did you have to search the facility? Of course. Did you have to search right around the facility? Of course. Banging out the 25% would make sense, but at the same time, checking some of these linear features, especially the closest linear features. So if she goes out the back door of the facility, she either winds up at that road or winds up at that drainage and then follows the drainage down. The interesting thing on that search, the first team, we got deployed at night. The first team that went down the creek found a sugar packet, just a little white sugar packet, and said, is this important? And they said, actually, she's known for sticking sugar packets from the cafeteria into her pockets. So that's quite a likely thing she would have with her. We sent the second team down the same drainage at night, and they found her essentially in the same location, playing in leaves and as happy as can be. So they walked, my guess is they walked by her the first time, but we found her the second time. So scenario lock, it's a condition in which a search planner settles on one scenario, which is often the most likely scenario, but doesn't consider alternatives. And it's our job to always consider alternative plans. Because if you haven't made up any additional tasks, then you either got to make up new tasks, or what I've seen in some cases, after people do the primary scenario, they say they're not out there and they suspend the search and go home. In the new book, I have research listed from new researchers. Polk and Dougherty introduced the watershed model. Eels did a lot of new subject categories coming out of the UK. Shadloff, Green, and Coyle let's see, what did they do? I'll think about it later. We get the book. Great Batch looked at drunk males and how they seem to be attracted to water, even though it's like the only bit of water around. He also did some POD research of the importance of radio distractions and how that impacts people's POD. You know, it does. If you're on the radio chit-chatting away, you can't visually search. It's basically what he found in a maritime, or And Dennison and Wilkins has done drowning research, looking at when bodies will resurface. I list a bunch of books that are recounting incidents because they're interesting to read, and lots of books stating how humans navigate under normal circumstances. In chapter 2, I talk about Israel, and probably the most important thing is the growth in the number of cases. So the lost person behavior book and the lost person behavior app is still based upon the 50,000 cases I collected in 2007. Has the app been updated? Only in the sense I found a couple of mistakes in the numbers and I fixed those mistakes, but otherwise, for the most part, the app is the same as the book. In 2014, I increased the database to 145,000 cases and did put that new data in here, but it's only for endangered. You're not going to find hikers or hunters or any of the snow or really any of the normal cognitive activities. It's just diminished cognitive abilities and kids in there. What I'm working on right now is what I kind of call ISRID 3.0. So right now I'm at 290,000 incidents, which is a dramatic increase, which will allow me to have new subject categories, more reliable data, et cetera, et cetera. It just takes forever. That's a picture of the US. I now have pretty much data from all of the states in the US except South Dakota and Louisiana for some odd reason. Probably more importantly, that's the data from the world, and you can certainly see a Norwegian flag flying proudly at the top of the slide. You know, you can't do better than that. You need to thank the folks at the JRCC who spent at least a week or two cleaning up the data, and I'll have to spend another day cleaning up the data just to get it standardized into things. So a lot more states or countries are represented now than the first edition. So far, my basic conclusion is people are people. What matters, especially a lost, stressed out human being, is a lost, stressed out human being. What matters is the terrain that they are moving through. And that's where I wind up seeing differences. Let's see. New Zealand police still owe me 20,000 cases. New Brunswick did get me their data. Alberta got me the data. Brazil got me the data. Taiwan owes me data. Finland, I filled out a 6-page request. It's still going through the bureaucracy of the law enforcement there, but they have a couple of thousand cases. I did get the data from Virginia. You know, my own state was like one of the most difficult places that it's like, oh, we'll get around to it, Bob. Let's see, no luck with Massachusetts so far. So in going from this book to this book, where I went from 50,000 cases to 145,000 cases, how much did things change? And the answer was really not that much. And that kind of like, I lost my enthusiasm to keep doing it. But anyway, so ISRID 1, if you just, this is for dementia, it's in miles, sorry about that. But we're just looking really at the relative changes. I initially had 95 people lost in mountainous terrain. And in ISRID 2 for dementia, which is a huge growth category, I had 1,207 people lost in mountainous terrain, and the 25 percentile went from 0.2 to 0.4, which really doesn't. You could say, oh, that's 50%. Yeah, no, that's operationally, that's a very little change. The 50 percentiles essentially stayed almost exactly the same. The 75% essentially the same. That's pretty much a real difference.
in the 95 percentile, but that's the ring you probably use the least operationally. It's kind of like you tell the helicopter to fly out that far. As I say, just so I could tell the family, yes, we searched the entire search area. But probably the biggest thing of the new data is it allows me to introduce new subject categories. So this is the shorter list of new subject categories. I've even come up with more since I made this slide. So base jumpers will now be broken into winged and non-winged base jumpers, because the winged suits, which I call squirrel suits, does allow for horizontal movement, which greatly increases the search area. And the winged suits account for, I think, about 90% of the base jump fatalities. And since a lot of them jump in black suits with black parachutes, because they're jumping off places they shouldn't be jumping, and they're hard to see sometimes. There will be a new category for beacons, for both 406 beacons and the commercial beacons as well. Brain injury, which often is referred to as traumatic brain injury, but I'm going to lump into just diseases such as encephalitis, which can change person's brain function, usually specific parts of the brain, and they can have a loss of spatial abilities. So that's why they get lost. Bridge jumpers was previously in the water category. But I find if people jump off of a bridge, now they wind up in the middle of the current versus the sides of a river, so they tend to go a lot further. And if it's a tidal river, then they can actually be either upstream or downstream of where they started. Cell phone forensics, I'll be showing you a little bit on that. Fugitives, runaways, scuba divers, aircraft is going to be broken into different types of aircraft or different scenarios. And what I mean by different scenarios is if it's an icing scenario, you get one set of statistics. If it's level flight into terrain, this does not work well. Cumulus grantis, you get another set of statistics. If you see a hook on the radar pattern, you get another set of statistics. And certainly anytime you're looking for a jet, when jets decide to go down, jets are very serious about going down. And even the 95 percentile can be remarkably small. In order to find the Air France incident, which started off with Air France was when it was flying over the Atlantic, was at cruise altitude. There's not too many accidents that actually happen at cruise altitude. So to get a database of commercial aircraft at cruise altitude, they contacted the Russians, who had crashed about 10 or 12 planes at cruise altitude. Let's see, I'll have another one on human remains. So if you find one bone and you're still missing the rest of the bones, where should you look and how far out do you need to look? And then a whole nother approach is a scenario approach, where it's not so much what the subject category was doing, but the scenario of why you think they are actually missing. So they may be missing because they got wiped out by an avalanche. And where should you look for avalanche subjects? Or maybe they could either be a kid, or they could have mental illness, or maybe they're trying to evade law enforcement, but that your subject is actually actively evading you as a searcher. So you could use the evading scenario. Maybe you have, for the medical scenario, maybe you have a hiker who is a known diabetic, who takes their insulin, and they took their insulin, but they didn't increase their food intake, and they went hiking. And they were late for lunch.
And when they were last seen, they were confused and irritable and slurring their speech. So you happen to know they have low blood sugar. So people have asked me before, well, should I use the dementia category? It's like, well, they really have dementia just because they're confused. So I introduced a new category called the medical category. The overdue category is a pretty straightforward one. You do the intended route, and if they're there, great. If they're not there, then well, that scenario can essentially be ruled out, unless they decided to take a shortcut, and then things could usually go bad. Stranded could be climbers that get stranded, people in floodwaters who get stranded, or people who get caught out in snowstorms and their tent, they're essentially stuck in their tent. So that's the stranded. And trauma is pretty self-explanatory. So those are some of the new categories I'll be working on. Oops. So here we have cell phone forensics. So sometimes you get just a very tight dot because you are actually getting GPS coordinates coming in over the cell phone forensics, and you can go there. And generally, that's where the subject is going to be. But keep in mind, the forensics are for the phone, not for the subject. So in this particular case, over here, they found the parking lot, they found the car in the parking lot, they found the phone in the car at the parking lot, but they didn't find the subject because he had walked off. So it was kind of like, well, we got a new IPV, and we can base up our search off of that. Sometimes it's just you get these polygons, and I'll show you in the next search that when you see a polygon that is kind of shaped like that diamond, that means you have gotten information from two different cell phone towers. So the question I asked was, okay, you've been giving me all this wonderful cell phone forensic stuff. What percentage of the time are they actually found inside the polygon? And it turns out this was based upon 24 cases. So I hate it when I get like a perfect 50% because people think I got like 4 cases or something. Half the time they're in the polygon and half the time they're outside the polygon. Okay, next question. If they're outside the polygon, then how far outside the polygon are they typically found? And it always says, it depends. Well, what does it depend upon? Are we looking for somebody in a vehicle or are we looking for somebody outside? Or, without a vehicle. So you got 2 sets of stats. If there's no vehicle involved, 50% of the time, they've just found 126 meters outside the polygon. So you just kind of take the polygon, 126 meters in every direction, and now you actually have a 75% chance of finding your missing subject. If they are in a vehicle, then it can be like 6.4 kilometers. But if they're in a vehicle, then you put more emphasis on the roads that lead out from the polygon. So
triangle where the two things intersect.
I guess you're doing something important.
With beacons, and the same thing is kind of a cell phone forensics. It's just an electronic signal, if you think about it. What can go wrong? One, the subject must be able to activate the beacon. You know, this would be an ELB, an ELT. But ELTs can self-activate at least if you crash your plane, and just don't crash it too hard or you kill the ELT. But what can go wrong? You can forget your beacon. You can't figure out how to work it. You can't reach it. You're unable to activate it. You have an injury or you're unconscious, and dead people don't set off 406 beacons. The beacon must have power. The battery could be too old. Active features, if you're talking about the commercial beacons, you can drain down your battery. Although some of the send devices, this would be like a Garmin InReach or the Spot type devices. They usually, if you have fresh batteries, usually and fresh, this is not something that happens in summer. Good for 1,000 messages. Then the beacon needs to be able to see the sky and pick up the GPS satellite. So it could be blocked by foliage, buildings, multipath, cliffs, mountains. The ionosphere could be acting up that day. The antenna could be broken, etc., etc. Then you need to see the sky to contact the satellite network. It's pretty much issues of the same thing. It used to be the 406 beacons relied mostly on LEO satellites. They're low Earth orbiting satellites, which, you know, pass by just every so often. I think all of the Russian satellites have fallen out of the sky. But now they've switched to essentially the GPS or the GNSS satellites. So those are MEO satellites, medium Earth orbit satellite, which pretty much can see almost half of the Earth at a time. So, and then those are able to triangulate a position. So it's a much more robust than the old system of relying on the LEOs. The satellite has to send the alert to a ground station. So for 406 and iridiums, that's not an issue. For the spot global stars, they are essentially nothing more than a mirror up in the sky. So the signal goes up, and then it sends it immediately back down to a ground station. So if it can't see a ground station, you're out of luck. So at high northern latitudes, you're the folks usually out of luck. Down in the States, it's not so much an issue. The 406 beacons have a memory, so they wait to see a ground station and then they'll send it down. And the iridium satellites essentially just have a repeater system, so they can bounce it off until they find a satellite that can actually see a ground station. The satellite sends the alert to the ground station. Just explained that. At the ground station, 406 beacons, there's no issues. For the commercial type of beacons, that if your subscription isn't current, it doesn't become to anybody's awareness. They just kind of made the commercial decision that it comes down to the first set of computers and it says, is the subscription active? If yes, it gets passed on. If no, it dies. There's no record. It's just done. At least that's what they're officially saying. So that's what I'm going to officially repeat. Position accuracy for 406. It turns out, even though it's getting the GPS signal, which is, we know, is usually accurate to like 3 meters or so, somebody made the decision when they decided how they're going to code the signal. They send degrees, they send the minutes, but then instead of sending the full number of seconds, they rounded off in bins of 4 seconds. So that means your accuracy, at least on your
latitude is only as good as 100 meters. Now, if you're looking for a ship, that works just fine. It makes things a little bit more challenging if you're actually looking for a person. So keep in mind, for 406 beacons, it's really plus or minus 100 meters. And then finally, the last part of the sequence is there's got to be SAR resources available to go out and do the mission. Okay, chapter 3. Previously, what I talked about was there's the temperate, there's dry domain, there's polar domain, even though I had no data on polar domain, I will this time. There's tropical. I have only the data out of Brazil now for tropical. And I usually treat it the urban domain as essentially its own separate domain. But you can go further into something known as divisions. And so do divisions affect the spatial models, i.e. distance from the IPP? I now can say, yes. Does it affect survivability? If it says likely, that means I haven't crunched the numbers, but I think it does, based upon my own judgment. Cultural, people ask me a lot. I don't have that much data that gives me like where they came from. What I have noticed is in New Zealand, they record the country the person came from. So there's a lot of people from Asia who go and get lost in New Zealand. Their behavior spatially isn't any different than when people in New Zealand get lost. The difference was more people from New Zealand are subjects of searches because they got injured versus the visitors usually are lost versus injured. So that's the big difference. Seasonality, it means I haven't crunched the numbers yet. I am pretty darn sure there are important differences between summer and winter. It's just somebody is me, needs to crunch that number. Weather, this was no longer in yellow. I did crunch the numbers. There's only a small impact on distance from the IPP due to weather. This slide kind of floored me. I thought it was going to be a big difference. It's the whole reason I had 4 graduate students working on it for a whole year. And they were really disappointed. I said, we're sorry to let you down, Bob, but we didn't find a big difference. And it's like, no, that's okay. Now we know the weather doesn't cause a big difference. Now, I think snow on or snow off does cause a big difference. Weather certainly does impact survivability, and I'll show you some slides on that. Some people would say this is the surprising factor. Sex does not affect distance from the IPP in the 3 categories I searched. I'll show you that slide. Gender certainly does impact survivability in a kind of complicated way. Age does impact distance from the IPP. Age certainly does impact survivability. Being solo or being in a group doesn't impact the spatial models, but it does impact survivability. Essentially, if you're in a group, there's a better chance of survival than people who are solo. Physical condition, another one. I thought physical condition was going to impact distance from the IPP. It doesn't, but it does impact survivability. Scenario, some of the scenarios impact distance from the IPP, and some of the scenarios impact survivability. Personality, nobody knows. It's hard to actually objectively measure personality. We're also unique. And will your personality change when you're lost and stressed out? Yes. The thing goes to sleep, so I have to press it twice sometimes, but sometimes I don't have to press it once. So here's examples of divisions. Norway would fall into the ecological division, the same as the Pacific Northwest.
up there on the left-hand side where it says 1.3. So what I'm finding is in the Pacific Northwest, people are going 1.3 times further than what the temperate data would suggest. And what I think is going on, it's my guess, I'm wrong a lot. Yeah, I mean, anybody who's in science is wrong a lot. Is you got more coniferous forests, which might be easier to move through than a full-blown deciduous forest that you find in the southeast, where a lot of times I can't see as far as from here to the table. There's so much vegetation during the summer. During the winter, it clears out a lot, but most people get lost during the summer. So here's survivability. This is all the fancy stuff with artificial intelligence the grad students did. The important thing is what impacts survivability the most. Well, first of all, it's time. Time is the biggest impact on survivability. Then it was age. Then it was average temperature. Then it was hottest temperature. Then it was coldest temperature. Then it was the population density, i.e., were you in an urban environment or were you in the wilderness? Then it was the subject activity. Then it was the sex. Then it was the mental fitness. Then it was the eco-region and blah, blah, blah. So, the biggest factors was the age and the temperature. And then we can take all of those factors and make a fancy computer program where you type them all in and you generate the probability of survival for that individual that you're looking for with the weather that you are expecting and that they have experienced to date. What I found, at least in the US, and I see a lot of searches in the database, suspended after a day or two. And that's over here, right? That's still like 50% survivability, and that just seems wrong to me. So I think if I can eventually get this out, I got the Python scripts now, but I still have to get a developer, which means I have to get funded to actually make an app so people can do this. So then I looked at, okay, how does, that was one group of grad students. Then the next group of grad students came along and it was like, how does weather impact distance from the IPP? It does, but it's the least important thing in the list. So it's almost trivial. I think what I may find is seasonal differences. But whatever the temperature at that one point in time probably isn't going to make that much of a difference. So males versus females, I always get asked about that. So there's no significant differences in the distance traveled from the IPP for hikers, dementia, and despondents. So those are the three I looked at because I got plenty of data, and that's what I was doing, getting ready for some presentation. I was getting ready to give. So I'm sure some difference is going to show up in some categories somewhere. Except for groups. Does turn out that a group of all males is different than a group of all females. So we could look at, like, say, the 50 percentile. I forget if it's in kilometers or miles, but we're really just looking at the difference. A group of all males would essentially always go a little bit further than a group of all females. But make them individually lost, and there's no difference. You can draw conclusions on why that is. I'm just not going. When we look at survivability, it turns out women initially have better survivability than the males. And I usually say that's probably because the males did something really stupid that got themselves killed in the first place. And that's why we're looking for them. At about day 9, we have a crossover event where for long-term survivability, the males do a little bit better. So in the current book and in the app, you only get 4 days worth of survivability projections. It goes out to 96 hours and then it just stops. Why I did that, I don't know, but that's what I did. Certainly it occurred to me, wouldn't it be nice to have like the full survivability curve for each of our various subject categories? So in this particular slide, the category that has the best survivability is our skiers. Usually fit, usually young, usually well-dressed, have certain amount of tools with them, i.e. skis, very useful for breaking into structures. And they even do better than the hikers and hunters until about day 9. The group with the best long-term survivability is our hikers, and the curve for hikers and hunters are fairly similar, but you can see that you still have 5% of your missing hikers, and I imagine this is your missing backpackers that have more tools for survivability with them. 5% are still found alive 24 days after they've gone missing. And 25% are still found alive at what looks somewhere between day 9 and day 10. The group that does the worst is our missing aircraft. You can kind of see basically half the people are killed in the crash. And then you almost lose almost half of those after the first day. So they're probably dying of trauma. You look at the Columbia crash that just occurred. The 2 people in the front seat were killed immediately in the crash. The 2 adults in the next row back survived for 4 days. And then the kid in the back of the plane, and they also have less mass, so there's less force in a crash, even with the same velocity. And they probably had less velocity forces. They survived the whole ordeal. If you have managed to survive the first day, then the survivability for a missing aircraft is pretty good. The autism, which is the ASD or the rainbow curve, and what else? I have a dementia curve up there, are actually pretty similar. You can see there's a pretty steep curve there. So even after 1 day, after the first day, they're not necessarily doing all that great. So what I'll have in the next edition of the book is I'll probably still have the first 4 days, but then I'll have the 25, the 50, the 75, and the 5%. Instead of calling it a 95%, I'll probably reverse it and just call the 5% survivability rate. So I'll probably call it, what will I do it? I'll have the 75%, the 50%, the 25%, and the 5% survivability rate, and give you the time. Of course, this is just time. To have the impact of weather and all those other factors that I know matter, there'd have to be a computer algorithm. Call it artificial intelligence. Does age matter? Yes, age matters. So slightly confusing graph where it says all, that just means I looked at all the stats, and the greater than 1 is kind of the classic, if 1 day has gone by, then what is their chance of survivability? So I didn't have all that much data for ATVs, but you can see if you're 1 to 9 on an ATV, what are you doing on an ATV in the first place? 100% of them survive. The 10 to 19-year-olds are probably going a little bit faster, 96%. survive. The 70 to 79 age group, only 50% survive. If we look at despondents, we started off for 10 to 19-year-olds, 64% survive. If we go up to 80 to 89-year-olds, only 34% survive. And then you can say, if you haven't found your despondent in the first day of searching, it's probably because they were suicidal instead of simply being despondent. And our 10 to 19-year-olds, it's just a 43% survivability rate. For our 80 to 89, they were all dead. And even our 70 to 79s, it's just a 13% survivability rate. Even in dementia actually has surprisingly decent survivability at the onset. But if you don't find them in the first day, it starts going down. And it really starts going down on the second day. So age certainly matters into survivability. It's just hard to get this data across to you, the user, in an easy format. So does age impact distance from the IPP? Yes, I think common sense would kind of tell us yes, although I'm used to my common sense being disproved. So this is for hikers in a mountainous temperate environment, where I divided it into those less than 65. And once again, I forget if I used kilometers or miles here, but it's the important is that the comparison between the two groups. And there you can see that the data for those that are 65 or older. And it's not too surprising, those that are 65 or older are found at slightly decreased distances for all of the rings. So should this data be presented differently? And probably what I've concluded is no. It would just make the book that much more confusing and that much more longer, because if you're looking for somebody under the age of 65, that is the vast majority of the data. So using those slightly different distances probably isn't going to impact the data that much if I pulled it out and made it separately. And then I just kind of figured that if you're 65 or older, the rings are further out than they need to be. So that means for the 25 percentile, you are actually, if you use just the classic 25 percentile, you will actually find 30% of your over 65 group. And your 50 percentile, you'll actually wind up finding 58% of your group. And is there a problem with that? No. So I'm just going to leave the rings the same, but just kind of know in your heart or know in your brain wherever that there are differences with the elderly. And well, I'm not going to call 65 elderly because I'm not that far away from it. Group survivability. Those who were out solo, sometimes they were part of a group, but then they got separated from the group, and that's how they got lost. 86% are found alive, 11% are found dead, 2.5% we never found. Generally, the never found convert to dead in the database, but nobody goes back and fills in the forms. So I just kind of know that from running my own searches. So not alive, we'll call it. We'll add the DOAs and the no traces or suspended missions and call it 13.5%. That's solo. And groups, we can see if you are in a group, there's just a 3.6% of having a fatality. And you could say, if you're in a group,
there's more opportunities to have a fatality, at least twice the chance of having a fatality, because there's at least two or more people. So the simple way of saying that is there's a 370% greater chance of a fatality if you're looking for a solo individual versus a group. Of course, when you find a whole group wiped out, it's really sad and depressing. Physical condition for the spatial abilities. So the general data for hikers, mountainous, temperate, you can see that the 1.5 to 50, the 75, and the 95%. And then you can see the difference in statistics if they're in excellent shape, if they're in good shape, if they're in fair shape, or if they're in poor shapes. It's like, yeah, the numbers are a little bit different, but they're essentially the same. And when you use like statistical tools to analyze them, to say something is significantly different in psychological or sociological kind of research, you usually want a p-value of 0.05 or less. We can see these p-values are nowhere near that. Most of them are so close to 1, they say, hey, there's just really no difference between these groups. So that was like, that kind of blew my mind when I saw that. So I was expecting it. For survivability, we get a much more extended result. And that is, if you're in excellent shape, we only have 2% DOA. If you're in good shape, 4% DOA. If you're in fair shape, 7% DOA. And if you're in poor shape, 12% DOA. So that's a 600% difference between the excellent and the poor. So it pays to be in good shape. Hooray. This is just polar domain data now that I actually have some polar domain data. So this is just the types of subject categories they wind up looking for. So snowmobiles, hunters, water incidents, hikers, and despondents are sort of the top 5. Very, very different than what we see sometimes in the temperate and in the dry areas. And also the nature of your country, or region. So in some places in the United States, hikers and hunters are still number 1 and number 2. But say Virginia, I would actually say dementia and despondents are number 1 and number 2. So who makes the fund? This is kind of gee whiz type of information. It's still nice to know SAR makes it fine 55% of the time when you got a wilderness or rural search versus your urban search where it's 43% of that time. The subject walks out 23% of the time in wilderness and rural searches, and only 12% of the time in urban searches. Because in urban searches, they usually have dementia or despondent or mental illness. The public finds the subject 10% of the time in wilderness searches, but in urban searches, there's a heck of a lot more public out there. It gets as high as 24%. A search gets suspended 4% of the time in wilderness searches, and 5% of the time in urban searches. And then investigation, i.e. you find them on a plane, train, automobile, bar, hospital, jail, morgue, whatever. 3% of the time in a wilderness search, but it becomes very important in your urban searches. Was there a time that you had for the breaks or? Yeah, I was just saying I've rambled on for 1 hour and 5 minutes, so Nobody interrupted me with questions, but I'm happy to take questions now because we'll forget them all after the break. Yes.
Yeah, I've got so many questions. I don't know where to start really.
Well, you do your top two, and then everybody else has none.
Have you looked at the data sets, the differences in data sets between the US, which is a large amount of your data set, and other countries?
I specifically look at between Israel one, between the data set in Australia, the data set and New Zealand. Going to the data set and Washington State and the data set and Virginia, and I found no differences. I wouldn't be surprised to find, and I just need to analyze it, between the data set and say my UK data, because they got canals and walk paths all over the place, and they cut down all their trees, they build boats and things like that. So they changed the environment so much. I wouldn't be surprised if, I'm not expecting, otherwise, the UK should be like the Pacific Northwest. And it's not, when you look at it.
Yeah, the second question was really about data sets and outliers and Bayesian analysis and stuff.
Okay.
I mean, do you look at outliers? Because you quote quite a lot in statistics as per percentages, but one outlier can actually throw that wildly.
Right, so the way I try to adjust and minimize the impact of the outliers is your second standard deviation out is going to be your 95 percentile. Therefore, whether they're 3 standard deviations out or 10 standard deviations out, or around 1,000 kilometers away, we have the 95 percentile. So all the numbers beyond the 95 percentile don't matter. So that's how I kind of address the outlier issue. I love these questions. I'm maybe minor nerdy out here, but it's okay.
I'm curious about the survivability. So when you say that, like, but once you get to like 16 days,
Right.
time, you're saying that 1 in 10 people that's found at 16 days was alive. It's not going to be like.
Yeah, so we have to go back to one of those. I need to go back to this. Okay, so if you're talking about somebody with autism, if you're out at 16 days, you're below 5%. If you're talking about a skier, at 16 days, well, that happens to be exactly 5% are still alive. Let's look at, like, say, the 7-day mark. So at 7 days, only 5% of our autistics are found alive. At 7 days, we got like 18% of our aircraft subjects and our dementia subjects are found alive. Let's see, that would be about 27% of our snowmobilers are found alive. Looks to be about 36% of our hikers are found alive, and about 55% of our skiers are found alive at 1 week. So that's how you interpret the graph. And if I had really wanted to geek out on this slide, from these curves, you can actually find like the log curve. So then from a computer point of view, you could like then just make a formula. So you input the amount of time and it outputs the probability of survivability. So people wouldn't have to interpret curves that just have to enter in the number of days. That's probably how I would make it. Because people have problems interpreting graphs. Yeah,
I'm just wondering, do you have any theories on what's happening to that horse here? Around day 8 between 9, just survivability just drops, so it was like 20% between those days.
It's hard for me to really guess is, they've run out of food,
Yeah, so
so their ability to generate heat is really poor at that point. Even if they were well dressed. Well,
I thought it was just cliff.
oh, Chris. It does look like a cliff effect. Yes.
Yeah, you're introducing the new scenario. Would that be like a separate? Where
put it in my hierarchy.
So until I figure that out, my thought is I'm just gonna make it a separate chapter.
stick it on?
So it's like subject categories and then subject categories / scenario. And then it's like, you figure out when you want to use it. Because I have not intellectually figured out, maybe I have this really nice hierarchy for the rest of the categories, but I don't know where to put scenario. To be honest. Yes.
That's quite interesting because from my limited experience, quite a lot of scenarios actually the lost person falls into a number of the subject category fields.
Right, so that's, and, when we come back, I have more on scenarios. Cause I actually thought one of the greatest deficits of this book was it didn't really tell you how to do scenario planning or work with, scenarios, but when I thought, how do I actually run a search? What is the information I consider? It's like scenario planning is a huge part of search planning. So it's like there is now a brand new chapter on scenario planning. So at the beginning of the search, you are often faced with multiple scenarios. So you're probably going to use the subject category. As the search progresses and you get more information, and the overdue category drops out. And you got good solid investigation that the subject not responding, or maybe just the opposite. Now you've got a good, despondent is an example of a scenario that is actually also already a subject category. Abduction is a scenario that is a subject category. If I have avalanche in there, that's a scenario. But, sometimes it's like real clear. We found the subject's ski tracks into an avalanche and no ski tracks coming out of the avalanche. Okay, we're going to go with the avalanche scenario, and that's also why it's kind of would be easy as a subject category onto itself. But like I said, the reason I kind of came up with that I have this need to do this is that hiker who clearly has low blood sugar and is confused, and now what the heck using the hiker category is not satisfying. But everything is pointing at the medical scenario. It just, you should always go through the other ones to really make sure you've ruled them out. But everything's pointing at that. And that should probably be the primary subject category you're using. So it's probably not going to be the scenarios are probably not going to be used so much at the onset of the search, but as information develops and you've finally got enough evidence that, hey, my SAR teams found my subject running away from me. We're going to go with the evading subject category, or we're going to go with that medical category. I don't think, and you should probably settle on, we're going to lock it to the overdue category.
But it would be nice to maybe see what does the overdue data tell us and look like that if we're at the onset, and that's one of many scenarios we're considering, and at the beginning of the search, that's often usually a pretty strong scenario, depending upon the information. What does that look like? And I can blend that with other things I'm doing. If you think of more questions, or if you're shy and just want to walk up to me because you don't want to talk in front of a group, and who knows how I'm supposed to repeat all these questions, but I forget. So sorry for you folks online. I tried my best. I can't remember everything. How long is the break for? Sounds good to me. Food, go get food. And then come back.
Yeah.
I'm gonna get.
Well, hello, people in the virtual world. And everybody else can now munch away. So as I was talking about one of the identified, I don't want to say flaws, but one of the identified absences in the lost person behavior book was it did not address scenario planning. So certainly the new book has a chapter called scenario analysis, which is chapter 5. And the basic process is gather information about the subject, including timelines. Look at the various scenario statistics you have in the book as a starting place, and then based upon the information you have at hand, decide if it applies, to determine which scenarios are more probable, and then how will those probable scenarios impact your tactical planning, and then plan and send resources there. Then I also introduced what I call a black box scenario and a scenario worksheet. Emergency backup. Was working. Ta-da! So let's look at a scenario. I'm gonna have to go outside my little white lines. Sorry, virtual people are going to disappear. We have 4 18-year-old college students. Any story that starts like that has got to be a good story. We have 4 18-year-old college students that hike to the summit of Old Rag Mountain, shown in the picture. The subject bets his friends he's going to beat them back to the car. They're going to have a race. They're going to follow the trail back. He's going to go cross country from the summit, which would be essentially going to the left. So let's look at the subject category. He's going to be classified as a hiker. The initial planning point is the summit of Old Rag Mountain. The destination is the trailhead back where the car is parked. We have a direction of travel. He's going to go north down a cliff face. His intentions are to follow a compass bearing. He does have a compass. North cross country. His group status has switched from group to solo hiking now. Personality is described as adventuresome, competitive, and he's a risk taker. Clothing or equipment is jogging shorts, a polo shirt, a wool sweater, old shoe, and a compass. Experience, he's been on a previous hike before, but he has no navigation or survival training. He has not been lost before. Medical, he's described as healthy, but he has broken 13 bones on 10 previous occasions, where it's due to daredevil activities and he's clumsy. It's not a good combination. Cognitive, typical. So the various scenarios we have to choose from, probably a little bit hard to see, is avalanche, criminal, despondent, drowning, evading, investigative, lost, medical, or overdue. And then those are actually described that in this book, where it has the planning impact and the field impact if you're out there on the search. So right off the bat, we said he's a hiker. So based upon 2,242 cases of missing hikers, 1% have been evading, 1% is investigative, 68% got lost, 2% were medical, 16% were overdue, 4% were stranded, and 7% was trauma. Another subject category, he is not a climber. He is not prepared to climbing. He didn't plan to climb, but he's essentially not throwing himself, but he's going down a vertical cliff where he should have climbing gear, but he doesn't. So the climber category might give us some useful statistical information. So I would list it here to get insight. So for climbers, 49% get lost, 16% have medical issues, 8% are overdue, 12% are stranded, and not too surprisingly, 26% have trauma. The reason why that number isn't maybe even higher is most people climb with a climbing partner, and if just a single person gets injured, well, most people have a climbing partner, so if one person's injured and the other person isn't, then they call, and it's considered a rescue versus a search. So these are just search scenarios. Then the next step is kind of looking at the unique things of this particular incident. The chance of an avalanche is 0. There's no snow. Easy. Criminal. There's very little criminal activity that occurs in this particular wilderness thing. We can't say no, or we can't say 0. It's always something to consider, but there's nothing, statistically speaking, nothing to support it. From the unique information on the case, nothing to support it. Despondent. From what we know about the subject, there was no despondency. Of course, we're getting the information from his 3 hiking companions initially right off the bat. We still need to talk to teachers and doctors if we don't find them off the bat and expand our investigation. Is there a chance he was in fact despondent, and that's why he came up with this harebrained scheme of going off of a cliff? Evading, I actually listed as possible, since it's usually associated with mental illness or kids, but a lot of times people who get head injuries then become evasive. So that was my thinking of listing it as possible. Investigative, this would be, he's hiked out another trail and went to a bar someplace, or found a tent and found a girlfriend, whatever. It's possible, probably not too likely, but it's possible. Getting lost, highly likely. I can think of multiple different ways he could have gotten lost on this little adventure. Medical, in the sense of heart attack, hypoglycemia is low. Drowning, there's really no water around, so that's low. Overdue, it's taken him longer to work his way out of the woods. That's certainly possible, or even likely. Being stranded, he got cliffed out, is certainly possible, and having trauma is highly likely. So then we kind of go on to the next step. What are we going to do about investigation? Since it was possible, we'll let the law enforcement do their whole investigative thing. As a SAR resource, I don't really have to worry about that. I assigned it to the police. Drowning, there was a creek at the bottom. It's like, yeah, I'll send a searcher along the creek. It's creeks, blue lines, I like searching anyhow. Evasive, it's possible.
I'm not too worried about it. I'm just gonna keep in mind that if I blow a whistle and shout his name, which I will be doing on this search, there still is a remote chance he may not answer. Even better chance he may not answer because he's unconscious or dead. Lost, there's, look at the decision points. Where would he go if he's lost? There's several different places he would likely go if he was lost and how he would respond. That's going to impact where I send my resources. The history of the area says people get onto the wrong trail. You could have made it down to the bottom of the mountain and then taken the left instead of taking a right. Or there's other trails you could have branched off. There's a whole network of trails. I'm going to have to run the network of trails. Overdue, I'm going to send a team along his intended route. If I really believe the overdue thing, I usually send a team from the IPP towards the destination and from the destination towards the IPP to cover the overdue. If there's a logical place in the center, I could get resources in quick, and I got enough resources, I would do that as well. The stranded or trauma one is the one that really calls out to me as the most likely, probably because I also know the solution to the problem. But even during the search, it was like, this dude has fallen and hurt himself. He's done it like 10 times in the past. So we need to search the cliff area. We're going to actually have to put in technical teams to search the cliff area. If I had aeronautical resources, I would put up a helicopter to help search the cliff area real fast. It turns out there was a cloud ceiling and it was raining really hard, about 3 centimeters an hour. So that made things fun. So at this time, there was no such thing as drones, but even during these worst conditions, I could consider, if there's a short break in the weather, of putting it in the drone to search the vertical cliff. But we did wind up having to put in, climbers. So here's kind of a scenario planning sheet. Those are the scenarios. You can enter the statistical likelihoods based upon what you find in here. And then you rate it as either 0, low, possible, likely, or highly likely, depending upon the unique circumstances of the search you're doing. It's always good to document what your reasoning is behind it. And then the planning impact. What essentially, it's the old, so what? How does this impact where you put your resources? And all this stuff can change with time. And then there's something I call the black box scenario analysis. And this came about, essentially, this is a good search that illustrates it. We got a 49-year-old male who's departed from his cabin, which is marked as the IPP right there. He's going to go ginseng hunting. So that's you don't shoot it with a gun. It's a gathering activity where you dig up the root. It's about $1,000 US for about every 20 plants. You find not a bad afternoon's activity. He has hunted for ginseng extensively on his property before. The plan is to contour around Cedar Mountain. So that's kind of the black line going around Cedar Mountain. Now, it does mean he's going into the national park, where you switch from being a ginseng hunter to a ginseng poacher. And then his destination, he was going to be picked up by a friend on an ATV and driven back to the cabin, which is the IPP. So our subject category is ginseng hunter / gatherer, which is where I put them in this book. In the new book, they're not your typical gatherers. I mean, berry pickers and mushroom pickers tend not to go that far off the trail. But ginseng hunters can go kilometers off of the trail. And of course, they don't tell anybody where they're going because the stuff's valuable, and they're not going to tell anybody where their favorite locations
are. So I may wind up actually moving it to the worker category, which is a group of people who tend to go extensively off trail to do what they're doing. The IPP is the cabin south of Cedar Mountain. The destination is via Gap. The direction of travel is north, contouring around Cedar Mountain. Medical is fit. And the dude didn't ever reach the destination. And I kind of, yeah, I gotta just talk this one through. As I was like running through this, it's like, well, why wouldn't he? He knows it. So it's like, well, I guess it's, trauma is a possibility if he sprained his ankle, abduction didn't make any sense, criminal, investigative. There's no bars. There's nowhere to go. He's on the mountain. He should have come out of the box at the top left, but he didn't. And I concluded with the scenario analysis, I don't know why he didn't. I just need to know, I need to search the black box. And if I don't find him in the black box, he came out of the black box. And where would he likely come out of the black box? Turns out he had been lost one time before in his life. And his strategy when he got lost before was to go downhill. So I just said, well, then we should search downhill from the black box. And that's what I recommended to the Park Service because, they bring me in on day 4 of the search. And it's like, they had so covered the 25 percentile because on the last search they missed somebody in the 25 percentile. So they spent 4 days searching the 25 percentile and the box. And it's like, it's time to not search the box. It's like, start sending teams downhill. And then that afternoon, they found a trail of clues and found him the day after that. Deceased, but at least he was found. The next chapter goes into more detail, the sequence of events that leads to somebody becoming lost. So people start at the IPP. If you got a normal cognitive person, or I'm not supposed to say normal these days, I'm supposed to be politically correct and say typical. If you got a typical cognitive person, they're probably not lost at the IPP. I have seen some hikers immediately go the wrong direction at a trailhead. But it certainly is the start of planning. Then they go a certain distance. And I imagine the distance they travel prior to making the error is probably accounts for most of the distance from the IPP. That it's hard to prove because in my databases, I seldom get, here was the decision point where they actually made the error. I mean, that would be super valuable information to have. But, if you're looking for a dementia subject and you find them, it's like, can you tell me where you made the mistake? Oh, they'll tell you something, but how much you can rely upon it. And even with some of the hikers in debriefing lost hikers, a lot of times they're not even sure where they made the mistake. But at the decision point, that is the 1 meter chunk of land where they were going the right way, and now they're not going the intended way. So we'll talk about what decision points are. Now, probably the reason why we have a search and they're not able to self-correct is some people walk off the trail and go, shoot, this isn't the trail. I'm going to go right back here, and now I'm no longer lost. So all those cases of backtracking that people do, they do it, but it never turns into a search. So we never find out about it. And you could say maybe they're not even lost. The ones we wind up looking for is the ones that below the decision point and keep going and keep going and keep going. Then the next thing is they are still moving. And why are they still moving when they're not on their intended route? Well, because it looks like their intended route. They've gotten themselves on a game trail, or maybe they're just in open mountains and it's hard to tell when. At some point, something subconscious starts to click that they're not, something's wrong. You know, the sun is on the wrong side of the sky now, or the moon has done a 180, or wasn't that mountain over there? Now it's over there. And how did that happen? Or had one dude in New Zealand get lost and they pulled out their compass and it's like, actually, they didn't have a compass. They kind of looked at the sun and it's like, that's funny. That's the sunrise, and that should be the west, and the sun shouldn't rise in the west, but it is, and it must be because I'm in New Zealand, and in the southern hemisphere, the sun rises in the west. So these are some of the cognitive biases that lead to very poor decisions. Then people realize they're lost and they have an emotional response, and then they pick a various strategy. So this is kind of, we got an expanded list of decision points in the new book. So road intersections, trailheads, trail social trail intersections, trail game path intersections. The start of any drainage, if you're on top of a ridge, often looks like a trail, or water can knock out the vegetation, so it looks like a trail. Anytime a trail takes a relatively sharp turn, people not paying attention can keep going straight. When I see 90-degree turns, it's like, oh boy, this really could have been where they made the mistake. Switchbacks, sharp turns, saddles, stream confluences, summits, any lane type of transition. There are times you can't find the decision point. So I had one particular case, the inchworm case. She's a through hiker on the Appalachian Trail, has a history of being spatially disoriented. But you know, usually if you're on the Appalachian Trails, they're beautiful white brick blazes, and you should stay on the trail. She got off the trail to take a bathroom break. So there was nothing, like, if you look at the map, there was nothing that said, hey, this is where somebody would take a bathroom break. So there was no chance of figuring out where her decision point was. Usually we can, sometimes we can't. Here's another example of a decision point. So subject was supposed to try to get back to that ridge parking area. They had hiked down to Andrews Bald, and now they were hiking back to the parking area. There's the sign that says parking area. You can see the trail going to the right. And it was like, my thought was, can you blow by this decision point and not notice it? There's a sign to the left. There's obvious wood turn to the right, but it was late evening. She was on a no food diet for the past 3 days. I don't recommend combining this with wilderness hiking, but that's what she did. So I said, okay, you're exhausted. You are hiking down. You are hiking like this in the head down thing. So I went out to the decision point. Could I walk by it? And I found, yep, I sure as heck could. Now, even though there were logs marking the path, there had been logs all along the trail for erosion control. So seeing a log wasn't necessarily a novel thing that would make you look up and look around. You had seen them all throughout this hike. So she kept going straight. Talking to the park, they said about once a month or once every other month, they have a hiker who blows by that parking lot and misses the turn. So there was statistical information supporting. The next decision point is at the top circle there at Mount Blockley. That's where the trail hits the Appalachian Trail, and the park says 99% of the people wind up going to the left versus the right.
just because that's how the trail sort of comes in. And if they do go to the right, they hit Klingman's Stone and they're no longer lost. And then the next thing I kind of looked at was a timeline. She had gone on 3 previous hikes. I was able to interview the daughter of when she started, when they stopped, and then look at the trail and figure out her hiking speed. Then with her hiking speed, put that in on the weather and on darkness. So it got dark pretty much right about when she hit where the map says Swan County. Then the next decision point, which is up at the top, is the beginning of the drainage. So beginning of drainage is standard decision point. And in fact, she wound up going down that drainage in the dark. And you can kind of see the little flag on the creek. So that's where she was found. Of course, I get called in on day 3 of a search, did that kind of analysis once I had a chance to talk to the daughter on day 4 of the search. So then it was day 5 of the search. We sent a team down that particular creek. They found the poncho she had with her, but not her. So there was then the next day after finding the poncho, we're able to get a team even further down because that's really, really nasty, thick terrain. So use the decision points. As I said, there's various biases of why people keep going. The most important one is actually known as the confirmation bias, which is we as humans like to be right. So we pay attention to things that tell us we are right, and we ignore things that tell us we are wrong. That's there. Then we also have the Dunning-Kruger effect. So people with very little skills think they know a lot. People with a lot of skills usually have a better idea of what they know. I mean, I quickly found out as a grad student just how ignorant I really was. Optimism bias, it's sure to work out if we just keep going this way. And another huge one is the sunk cost fallacy. We've already gone so far this way. Maybe just around the next bend, we'll find something. So, do have another incident here that is interesting to read for cognitive bias. If I just find it in the new book. Jack and Jill left the trail to fill their canteens with water. Jack fell down and lacerated his scalp, and Jill came running over. Jack got up after Jill applied direct pressure. They decided they needed to go back to camp. Perhaps a shortcut to save time. With little experience, they thought it was easy to navigate cross country. That's the Dunning-Kruger effect. They recently heard that Hansel and Gretel had made it home okay after a cross country adventure. That's the availability heuristic. It shouldn't take long since the normal path was quick, so the shortcut must be quicker. That's the well-traveled road effect. So off they went. After a while, the woods become thicker, darker, and the way steeper. Obviously, they both thought they must continue this way because of the sunk cost fallacy. It was sure to work out. Optimism bias. They did, in fact, stumble out to an old logging road, but which way to go? They decided to go downhill when they came to a junction. The junction had an old wooden sign indicating they were headed the wrong direction. They decided the sign was angled wrong and they should continue downhill. Confirmation bias. They hiked a little further, came to another sign, which clearly pointed out they were headed the wrong direction, but they both agreed that whoever puts out signs doesn't know what they're doing. That's the backfire effect. After a bit, both Jack and Jill considered suggesting that perhaps they were wrong, but didn't want to upset the other. That's groupthink. Fortunately, another Jack with his cow came along and gave them the accurate directions. So, cognitive bias. Once you realize you're lost, there is a huge adrenaline rush. And part of that adrenaline rush is called fight, flight, or freeze. Another reason why our lost people just want to keep moving. Everything in their body is telling them to move. Except there is a subgroup of people who will just freeze in place and cannot make any decisions whatsoever. But it's kind of nice because then we at least are going to stay in one place. So here's an incident of somebody's emotions. Where was the leg? What happened to that leg? He feels outside himself or another landscape. What if I don't find my tent? Idiot. Another bog. Start staring at it, wondering if it's only a dream, a nightmare. Get hold of yourself. What's up with all this negativity? In 1 hour, it's going to be dark. And it could get cold. It could get very cold. You could freeze to death. Suddenly he's claustrophobic, barely able to breathe, tears rimming in his eyes, vision blurs, he feels disoriented, he feels the panic, he's kept at bay for 2 hours, starting to rise, he feels his temples pound, he can't believe anything. This is not really happening to him. So you can even go to signs and symptoms of disassociation. So it can feel like an out-of-body experience, feels like you're a different person. You can become emotionally numb or detached. There's an altered sense of time. And with an altered sense of time, you're going to have an altered sense of distance as well. Can't remember how you got someplace. You can start hallucinating, seeing things, hearing voices, intense flashbacks. And you know this isn't normal, so you can feel like you're going crazy. You can feel little or no pain. Tunnel vision, super common. Becoming immobile, lightheaded, head feels full, feels your heart pounding, tingling, nausea, vomiting, becoming pale. The list kind of goes on. And now we're expecting them to make great decisions. So the bottom line is don't expect a lost person to make great decisions. Eventually, they do kind of make some kind of decision of what they're going to do to get out of this situation. So I have seen, usually among kids, just random wandering. Now, random wandering doesn't mean it doesn't get you any place. You do, so this is an example of a statistical random walk. So you can actually move away from the IPP with random walking. Contouring, which will generally only occur in your more mountainous terrain. I don't want to go up, I don't want to go down. That leaves contouring as your option. Direction traveling. I will go in one direction. If I go one direction long enough, I'm sure to get somewhere. I don't know how well that works in Norway, but it certainly works in Virginia. The longest I can go is 16 kilometers without hitting a road or trail. The problem is, as you can see on the yellow lines, sometimes you can actually say, I'm going to go that direction, and it works. As you can see in the blue lines, people just wind up walking in circles. These weren't lost people. These were just essentially, you get undergrad college students and you lie to them. Actually, in this case, they didn't lie to them. They just said, we want you to walk a straight line and go that way. And then they had somebody following them with a GPS and a radio, and then saw where they actually went. Route following, another common one. You find a route, a linear feature of some sort, and you follow it. You don't know where it's going to go, but you follow it because some person made this, or in a case of a water course, that's just the natural land guiding you. Some people will go uphill because they think they'll get a better view. Some people will climb trees to get uphill to get a better view. Some people will go uphill to try to find a cell phone signal. Some people will go downhill because downhill seems like the easier way to go. Some people will set off a beacon. Some people will stay put and like build a shelter and prepare for long-term survival. Some people will do nothing, and obviously that's staying put, but they're essentially have given up. And they're just going to sit there. They're not going to actively make a shelter. They're not going to actively signal
in any way. So what is found? There's passive strategies. Well, oh, that's too long to talk about. It's kidding. How do we actually navigate? So we have to figure out direction, which is various angles. So that's our vestibular system that gives us bearings and angular direction. Then to calculate distance, we can use time versus speed. So time is our circadian system. However, our sense of time is not highly reliable, and it is hugely impacted by anxiety, because that will stretch out time on you. To figure out speed, we use something known as optic flow, how quickly things are coming past us. And we also use the vestibular system as well to sort of know how much we're accelerating or decelerating. Then it's kind of, we also have a proprioceptive system, which is our brain. Fortunately, we don't have to do this. Our brain actually keeps track of how fast our legs are moving and if we're taking short steps or long steps. And then all of these systems are tied together in a motor feedback system to try to keep track of the fact of how far we're going. But without feedback, we get lost. You blindfold people and ask them to walk a straight line, 100 meters, and they're circling. Some people even less than that. So I talk about myths and legends. There's some people who believe, especially particle motion models, tend to have the subject moving at a constant rate away from the IPP, and then you get something known as the donut hole effect. But it doesn't really exist. We see most people are found a short distance, and is a distance decay when we look at real data. Some people think, usually computer scientists, that an agent-based modeling doesn't require human input. Just let the model run. I find as a search planner, I need to have human input. I need to do search, scenario analysis and a bunch of other things. Some people have said lost person statistics is a pseudoscience. That's because they don't quite get the fact that I can't predict where that single person is, but it's a game of probability. I can tell you high probability areas and low probability areas. Lost person stats can't predict behavior. You can't, once again, predict the behavior of an individual, but you can say, as a group, where are your high likelihood places and your low likelihood? Some people say search theory works fine on the ocean, but it doesn't work on the land. And it's like, well, what is search theory? Search theory is essentially three components. Can you predict more likely areas and less likely areas? Yes, you can, because I've been doing it for years. Can you determine people's probability of detection? Yes, you can, if you measure it in objective ways and not subjectively. Can you figure out optimal allocation of resources? Yeah, it's just a bunch of math combining those two things. It's certainly possible. The land's not any different than the maritime world. I mean, the difference with the maritime world is after your subject stops moving, they keep moving because of drift and wind. A full moon increases the chance of a SAR incident. Well, how many people believe that? And it's usually like 40%. And among nurses who work ERs, it's like 80% believe that. But every time you actually do an objective study, it doesn't matter. The only situation where a full moon matters is if you do coastal maritime rescue. There's more rescues when there's a high tide or a low tide than there are otherwise, and that's pretty easy to explain. The point model is a new model which just says what
what percentage of people are found within 100 meters of the IPP and the destination? So among autistic kids, 4% were found at the IPP, and none of the autistic kids told anybody what their destination was. So I had no destinations. Among typically developing children, 13% are found within 100 meters of the IPP. A lot of times taking a nap, in the bed, under covers, in the closet, in a pile of stuffed animals, et cetera, et cetera. And 11% have in fact reached their destination. That means 25% of the people, kids, you can find just by checking 100 meters of those two locations. I have a lot more data. ISRID 1, 50,000, ISRID 2, 3 times. ISRID 3 is going to be 6 times the original. I got more coordinates, more subject categories. A lot of people use D4H, and that actually helps collect stats. Your joint RCC does a good job of collecting stats, so that's a real help to me. I spend more time actually explaining each of the tables in the new book, giving advantages of the model and disadvantages of the model. So we have the classic ring model that we all know. The advantage, super easy to apply. You don't need a base map. You can draw it on anything. It actually has high scores. It's very predictive of where you're going to find people. You can calculate p-dens for each quartiles, and that helps prioritize areas closer to the IPP. Yay! Disadvantages. It's agnostic to the local terrain. Is local terrain important? Of course, but it ignores it. It ignores the local vegetation. It seems like a barrier because you've drawn a line on the map, but it's no barrier. I mean, if I come to the line, it's not like I flip a coin to figure out I should go further. It's very large stair steps as you transition from each ring to the next. The reality of the situation would be a smooth curve. It's hard to show that without an actual computer. How do you use it? You plot the IPP on the map. You look up the distances in the book or in the app. You draw the rings onto the map. You prioritize the inner rings due to higher POD. And tactically, you're off and running. And then the media and everybody else thinks you're really smart. I don't know why, but they think you're really smart. So this is in miles, but it makes the same point. So I guess this was dementia, temperate, mountainous. You can see the 25 percentile is 0.2 miles, which is 0.13 square miles. There's a 25% chance the subject's going to be in that first ring. So that gives us a probability density of 1.99. For the 25% to the 50% ring, that's now an annulus of 0.5 is where the ring is. That gives us an area of 0.66 miles. It's still a 25% chance they're in there, but now our p-den has dropped down to essentially 0.4. For the next ring out, which is at 1.2 miles, which is just still, I guess that's, yeah, that's no 1.6, I think. Anyways, not good. It's too late in the day to do kilometer to mile conversions. And we can see, the POA is still 25%, but now our p-den has dropped down to 0.7. And of course, we have that huge leap between the 75 and the 95 percentile. We jump all the way from 1.2 to 5.2 to now we got an 80 square miles, which would be a heck of a lot more square kilometers. There's only a 20% chance that they're in there because it's from the 75 percentile to the 95 percentile. That's a 0.002 p-den. And if we wanted to search all the way out to the 100 percentile, and this is the reason, because of these outliers, give the 100 percentile, but I got the database, so I know. 30 miles. As the crow flies, without using any form of transportation. So confirmed on foot, 30 miles. So it meant that they went more than 30 miles. But that's 2,742 square miles, a 5% chance they're actually going to be in there, and our PDEN is pretty darn low. Hence, we don't have the time and energy or resources to do that kind of thing. That's why I don't give the 100 percentiles. Find locations. So here's an example of Shenandoah National Park. Park close to me. It's 800 square kilometers. And we're going to say if the hiker is lost, they're going to be found in the park. 100% chance of that. So you can kind of see the PDEN value of trying to search the entire park. How about structures? Well, there's 351 structures in the park, which takes 3.5 square kilometers of space. There represents 0.4% of the actual park, but there's a 13% chance our hiker could actually be found in a structure, especially if it's a bar. So we could see, whoa, what the PDEN value is. It's 0.04. There's a 13% chance our subject could be found on a road. There's 380 kilometers worth of roads. So we get another 0.04. Trails, there's a heck of a lot more trails in the park. There's 830 kilometers worth of trails in the park, but trails aren't as wide as a road. They're a road. I gave it a value of 1 meter, I think, or maybe I gave it a value of 1.5 meters. I forget what I did, but it's not as wide. So we only have 1.7 square kilometers of trails in the park. 25% chance a lost hiker is going to be found on a trail. So we can see our PDEN value is the highest of 0.15. So running that network of trails certainly makes sense. Not that we have to run all of those trails. We probably shouldn't, probably don't have the resources to run the trails that are out beyond the 95 percentile. Well, how about the woods? There's 740 square kilometers of woods in the park. And there's a 7% chance our hiker's going to be found in the woods. But we can see that's a pretty dismal PDEN value. But what about the woods that fall in the 25 percentile range? Well, we can see that's 3.8 square kilometers. And that's 0.07. So we need to check all of the woods within the 25 percentile. And I would imagine we probably need to check all the woods that fall in the 50 percentile. And we may even need to check all the woods that fall in the 75 percentile. But there's no way we're going to search all the woods that are the 75 to 95 percentile. And that's where we're going to rely more on the structures, roads, and trails and search all of those that fall in the 75 to 95 percentile. So there's math that says that's a good thing to do. And there's more math, but it's getting late. So reflex tasking. Basically, this just made the point of searching everything beyond the 75 percentile, nearly impossible. But why would somebody get out beyond the 75 percentile? It's probably because they follow a linear feature. So what this is saying is if we search all of the linear features outside the 75 percentile, we will actually still have a PDEN value of 0.04, which is pretty good. I mean, it looks small, but it's actually pretty good as things go in searches. Reflex tasking, pretty much the only change I've made is I've always described spokes on a wheel. And you visualize spokes like this, but sometimes the trails go like this. So if you want to think of a spider web, it's okay to think of spider webs.
If in the United States, we have 4th of July parade where people decorate their bikes with like streamers woven into the spokes. So if you want to think of like woven things that go around it as well, please do that, because it's not only the trails that lead away from the IPP, those probably have higher priority, but the left hand and right hand turns and errors and decision points, they're important as well. And it's all supported by math if you can. This is what we call linear escape sometimes. This is somebody coming off of Mount Rainier. They managed to lose the trail, but they essentially found a drainage and they followed the drainage on out. So fortunately, the search planners, this is beyond the 75 percentile. Search planners told the helicopter, fly all the way out to the 95 percentile ring as you follow these various linear tracks. So I have a little bit more information on how to use the book. So at the initial stage of a search, you start with intelligence, you figure out the subject category, you figure out where the IPP is. It has extra words in there as well. And you should probably have at least a brief thumbnail description of what's going on. You look at the environment, because you got to figure out what ecoregion it falls into. You got to look at, is it mountainous or not? Is it urban or not? And it's a good idea to know what the weather is going to do just from a searcher safety standpoint as well. And what your light is doing. You should consider your scenarios at the very beginning of the search. I would just say, well, what are the possible scenarios from my thumbnail description? I'm not going to go through a big formal analysis. It's like, well, the dude went off the top of a mountain. He either fell and hurt himself or he got lost. Okay, I'm just going to go with that to get my planning going. I use my bike wheel model. I draw all those little squiggly lines. I will do what I call a quick consensus process. I'll draw my squiggly lines. I'll walk up to my resource that I trust the most, another planning person or a field resource. It's like, does this make sense to you? They go, yes. They always go, yes, if it's me. So what I actually have to do is like give them a blank map and say, what do you think are the likely areas? And if they draw places that make, that agree with me, we got a consensus. We're good to go. We don't have to do any numbers or anything fancy. And then I get the teams out. I track the teams. I track the clues. I debrief the team. I collect their PODs and I update information based upon those results. If that doesn't find my subject, I might have learned more about my subject and I might have to change my subject category. Yeah, it turns out he's actually been depressed. And so now I got to consider a despondent scenario. I probably filled out like the paperwork, whatever paperwork thing you do to collect information. I've now actually filled out, or I should have filled out that paperwork now. I potentially have run cell phone forensics. If those are available. For the environment, I've learned more about the environment because I put STAR resources out there. For my scenario analysis, I will actually do the formal scenario analysis I described. For the reflex tasking, if I haven't completed all my reflex tasking, well, I still have to complete those. If I did my reflex tasking at night, I repeat them all in the daytime. I'll look at my 25% zone and make sure I've repeated tasks. And I also like to do something known as resource mixing. So if I've only put dogs into an area, I'm not going to write off the area until I put some kind of visual search in there. And if I've only put visual search in there, I want to put a dog potentially or horse or some other kind of resource in there. And I'm starting to move my area search up to the 50% and potentially a little bit beyond, because math that supports that. And then deploying the task is really the same thing. You tell them what you want them to do and they go out and hopefully do what you told them to do.
I like to think of when I come to a search, I always say ask, think, act. Which is ask to collect more information, think about the information people are giving me, and then act on it. Sometimes acting on it just means asking a few more questions, but I'm always highly aware my real goal is to find the missing person, and I don't find missing people until I get resources out into the field. So when is the second edition going to be available? Good question. I don't know. I can give you some probabilities, but it's wishy-washy. 10 chapters are written, and I've sent out to like 50 reviewers and got comments back, I think like 30 of them. So that's not too bad. There's 4 new chapters: scenario analysis, lost person responses, reflex tasking, and integrating the book. I'm down to only 2 providers pending, giving me information. I'm still waiting for my data from New Zealand and more data from Virginia, and maybe some data from Croatia. I have a to-do list. I still need to collect a little bit more data. I've started cleaning the data. I have like 25% of the data cleaned so far. I need to finish that. I've hired even more people to work on that. Eventually, the data will be all cleaned and ingested into the database. Then I need to generate all the statistics that you find in the book. Then I need to actually write the subject categories. I've actually started writing the subject categories before I get the data, just because some of it is just basic research, as like I'm looking into abductions and no body searches and et cetera, and all that kind of stuff. So I've actually started the update new categories as well. Clean data done, ongoing format haven't started. Obtain summary statistics have not started. Verify all of the data have not started. Update reviews of 1 to 10. So I've gotten comments back, but I haven't listened to any of the comments or done anything about them yet, but I will. Update the subject categories. I've started that. Research and write new subject categories. I've actually started that. I'm on abduction, which is the very first one, so I haven't gotten too far. Then we're in the book editing process of line and copy edit, send out for more reviews of the rest of the book, update and correct, typeset, verify permissions, proof and print. So to me, that sounds like somewhere between 6 months and 2 years. My goal is let's try to get it to, I'm at the part of like just dealing with the book type issues within a year. I have fooled myself into thinking that's possible. I don't know. Depends how many trips I go on. This much work, no, not this book. This in the new book represents that in the old book. So having a nice handy to use fit in your ops kit thing didn't seem to be like it was going to work out. So my goal is to have volume 1 and then volume 2, which I'm going to have more categories. So it's going to be at least that thick. So this is probably what you carry out into the field. This is what you really do need to know at some point, but probably don't need to carry out with you in the field. So I do think there'll be a 2-volume approach. I don't know about binding. I might have, for the field version, continue with this kind of wire-o binding. It does have the advantage. You can fold it in on itself and lay it flat if you have limited space. It's pretty darn durable. I mean, I've seen some of your books and they're pretty banged up, but the pages are still holding together at least. If you tried doing that with a paperback book, it would be great for sales because your book you'd have to buy a new book every year, but you just buy the app. So, anyways, I will probably have a hardback version just to have something fancy to put on the shelf, and that's what libraries buy, and it's really, really expensive to print a hardback, but for people who want to have a hardback, it will be available. All right, that's my thought. Other items, the lost person behavior app. I will update the app once I'm finished updating the book. The app was actually designed in a way, it's just a single file that has all the stats in them. So I just need to update that with the new numbers, and then we'll update the app, and then the two will remain in sync. FindStar mobile app is a new app I have that deals with POD and predicting PODs using different methods. So if you use critical spacing, you can put in whatever critical spacing you're using, whether it is a high, medium, or low vis subject, because that actually matters, even though it's taken into consideration in the critical spacing process. It turns out the critical spacing process, you are what's known as an alerted searcher, because you know where the thing is and you know you're looking right at it, and you know if you walk by it, everybody on your team is going to laugh at you. So you better get it right. On a real search, you don't know where the targets are, and you're likely to be distracted in a long period of time. So there's a little bit of a hit you take even on high vis subjects, and there's a heck of a lot of a hit you take on low vis subjects. So the app takes that into consideration, along with things such as fatigue, whether it's day or night, a bunch of factors. I just did want to point out the Journal of Search and Rescue, because I'm an editor. It's free. Take a look at the website. Just type in Journal of Search and Rescue and you'll find it. There's also another new book called Intelligent Search by Chris Young. That Chris came out to the your conference either last year or fairly frequently, and probably talked about his book. And then I have my own software that integrates the SAR stuff and the rest of SAR planning. But I'm also working on an API that can be integrated into other people's software. So all of the search theory stuff is taken care of, and most importantly, where are the likely places to look based upon integrating all the models together. So certainly the software I use, you can do the Matson process, and then that's blended together with the rest of the statistical model. So there's an example of the blend of all of the models together. For the API, we would probably give you squares, much like the maritime software that gives you the probability in each of the squares. It does the search theory for you, where the darker the color, the higher the PDEN value. The lighter the color, the less. It also gives you the numbers. Just search the biggest number first, and you're now doing formal search theory. So POD, here's a problem. You got a team of 6. They've searched for 5 hours. They've searched Maple Beach Forest with the leaves off, so it's fairly open. You're looking for a medium visibility adult subject. The size of your search area is 1 kilometer. Don't know how much effort I made to make a 1 kilometer test. The track is shown. This is the track of the team leader who was carrying the GPS. So the track, just to make the math extremely easy, was exactly 5 kilometers long. What do you think the POD is? Because these are the type of questions you get asked on a real search sometimes. What do you think the POD is? Well, 50 to 60%. That would be a POD that I call generated by social norming. You've just learned to say 50 or 60%. Nobody's really going to question you too much if you tell that to a debriefer. I've learned this a long time ago. Okay, So we could actually use our RD value calculator for, what did I say, a Maple Beach forest with the leaves off. That has a range of detection. So if we were to do a critical spacing experiment, I would expect it to come out to be about 50 meters. So we can put in 50 meters. On the app, you just have to press the area. I've said it's a meet. That 50 meters was based upon a high vis adult subject. So, but we got a medium vis subject. It's adult, it's day. So it's going to be knocked down to 37 meters is what our critical separation is. Copy that to the clipboard. It goes into our area custom visual. Medium vis. Size of the search area was 1 square kilometers. We had 6 people on the team. We measured it with our GPS. So we come up with a track line of 5 kilometers, and that actually gives us a POD of 84%. From the Red Cross folks this morning, that's using the random curve and not the inverse cube curve. For the rest of you, don't worry. Okay, that's great. I also made the correction factors. Nobody was fatigued. Nobody was under the age of 18. I didn't have any tracker, and the task was done during the day. Same track, same GPS. My 6 searchers are all drowsy. 5 of them are under the age of 18. And the team leader is obviously over the age. 18, I had no trackers. This task was actually done at night. And you can't see the next one, but I think I put 5 of them had flashlights that were generating less than 200 lux, measured 1 meter away. Why do I even have this kind of data? Is because I conducted experiments. I let trained searchers use whatever flashlights they wanted to bring. And some people had pathetic little LED things as headlamps or pathetic little LED things. Some of them would have an LED, but then have a bright flashlight, handheld. And then I would measure the brightest of the light. So 5 of them have headlights with less than 200 lux. And now you got yourself a POD of 5%. So those correction factors really start mattering. So while GPS tracks are great because they show the area search, they show any gaps in the area, it gives you the track length, and it's part of real-time tracking. So every team should have a GPS. I have nothing against GPSs at all. The bad is it doesn't account for the sweep width factors. Sweep width factors are determined by the nature of your searchers, your search object, and the terrain you are actually moving through. And that's what sweep width. So the ugly is the GPS track is not a substitute for POD. You can't say we have good coverage because all the lines look good. You have to look at the rest of the story. And then what do you do with that POD? It altered your POA. And the better the POD, the less POA you're going to have in an area. And sometimes if you're on a long protracted search, you're no longer in what I call the intuitive world. In the intuitive world, we haven't searched the place. It has high POA. We should search them. Once you searched an area with high POA, say right around the IPP, if you have a POD number, you can put that in and you can see the POD went down where you searched. And the next place you search should probably be those really dark blue boxes that are right above it. That should be the next place you go. And then there's even darker places, but you can actually see there's more POA left right around that one area we searched than these outlying areas. So that area would need to be searched a second time
before you go to some of those more outlying. Now, we can make heuristics that just say, search the 25 percentile at least twice. I mean, that's great, but you know, if you did a night search with a 5% POD, it's kind of like that search never even happened. As a matter of fact, if you know you got fatigued searchers and they got pathetic flashlights and they're explorers, what we would call explorer scouts under the age of 18, don't even put them out there. Really, you know, give them some sleep and let them become more effective searchers during the day. Now, that was for visual search. Turns out for auditory search, if you actually thought there was a good chance there was a subject out there who could shout, even fatigued searchers can usually hear somebody shouting if they're nearby. So that's something else you'd have to consider. Yeah, everything in the world. So that's my little chit chat. Thanks for staying so late. I'm still in a little time zone difference. So it's really not all that late for me. But once again, we're happy to do the question things, and I have no idea if people have sent in questions. Yes. Oh, no problem.
Yeah, if you go back to the P-den idea.
Yeah.
One thing that you have, well, maybe I've missed it, but you haven't really mentioned efficiency of tasks. If you've got a P-den of 0.04, but that task can be carried out relatively rapidly, is it better to put your resources into that than a P-den that's higher?
Yeah, that's called probability of success rate or PSR. And what I didn't really want to get into, but since you brought it up, where is the search theory slide? Was it? Can't remember. Here we go. The numbers here that actually correspond to the shading, those are PSR calculations and not PDEN
Weighted type of.
calculations. So what you actually do to calculate PSR, it is the sweep width times the initial PDEN times the velocity of your resource. So the velocity is actually calculated. So when I've done some drone experiments, I actually found the ground searcher often had a higher POD. Now, the PDEN's the same because it's the same subject out there, but the ground searcher had a higher POD, but a much slower velocity. So the drone could usually finish the task in a quarter of the amount of time. So when you calculated the PSR, the drone came out ahead on its PSR. It would actually say that should be the resource that actually should get into the area first. The nice thing about a drone is you can usually do the two tasks simultaneously. But if you got an operation of, you got the drone operator and their image analyst, and you can put them either in the field or have them flying the drone, then they should actually fly the drone. In some circumstances, it depends upon if it's full-blown canopy, then, you know, the POD is so low for the drone, especially if it's a low vis subject, that it's better to have the ground searchers. But yeah, the concept's PSR, and this actually calculates the PSR number.
I have no gift for you this time, but
Ah.
we take you out for dinner.
I still haven't figured out what you gave me.
I don't know.
From
I don't know.
the main.
Maybe
conference.
Anja know. We have been more than 120 on Teams and 116.
Oh, okay.
Excellent. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And, we take you out for some meal afterwards.
Oh, is that a stretch? Oh, okay. I was like, no, I want to get out of here.
Okay.
And as before, if you're shy and have any other questions, it's going to take me a little bit of time to pack up.
We are really looking forward for the second edition. We have delivered our cases for the last 8 years. It's about 12,500 cases, and we have arranged for data every year. The last year it was 1,500 cases, so it should be like that for 2023 as well.
Yep.
So it's
And when
very
you
interesting.
contribute a lot of bias, I mean, a lot of data, then the database becomes biased towards your data.
Oh, yeah.
I haven't found a way to control for that.
But thank you anyway. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.